So I am going to read Herbert Huncke, the beat poetry junkie, or whatever they called him. He was influential in bringing many people together in the beat poetry. Yes! Fuck off! You want me to end it right now? Somebody hit Sully over the head with a chair. Okay, I'm just going to get into it, and maybe you'll believe me. Herbert Huncke, dancing in prison. I've been in prison. They don't dance in prison. Nobody dances unless perhaps in the cell alone, snapping fingers and wearing earphones, and of course in dreams. And there are good sounds in the prison I was in because it is close to Canada, Montreal, and they like fine sound, and many of their programs are dedicated to young jazz musicians, and it is not always commercial, and some of these cats come on. And then there is some crazy stuff too, right here, that occasionally reaches there. Also in the yard, groups with horns, guitars, and everything to drum, to let go, and clap hands and beat, and I've heard it great. In fact, there was one way out man on a sax who blew all the time alone or with others in the cell alone, and sometimes with a guy 2 cells away who would pick on a guitar and listen to the Jap, and these guys would really let go till 7 o'clock when the bell would ring for no more talking. They sometimes talk about dancing, remembering past experiences with social chicks who could dance their ass off, man, or go into the Palladium, and even sometimes the Old Savoy and innumerable other spots, especially when name bands were on the scene, Basie, Ellington, Kenton, all of them. Of course, names are mentioned like Miles Davis, Yardbird Parker and Shearing, and Sarah Vaughan, Anita O'Day, Keely Smith, Dakota Staton, and I could go a while yet, but most of those are for only hearing only. I don't suppose that is actually true, because one can dance to any sound. Anyway, I danced last night, and it made me very happy, and I'm not a clever dancer, that is. I don't ever know what I'm doing, particularly with my feet, but I always sort of let go, and wow, I get some great kicks, and I did last night. Herbert Huncke, Part 2. Tattooed Man. Mardi Gras just passed in New Orleans. Thinking about it recalls to mind Don Castle, the tattooed man. And I had met one evening on Old Oak Street Beach in Chicago, later running into him in New Orleans. He was a rather strange man, an ex-junkie, show worker, and poet, tattooed from a line circling his neck like a collar, to his wrists on both arms, and his ankles on both legs. There was a large red rose tattooed on his penis he delighted in telling about, describing in detail the discomfort and pain he had suffered at the time of the actual tattooing. He lived alone and claimed kindredship with, I like that, the guy's got his dick tattooed, now he's living alone. He lived alone and claimed kindredship with spirits from another world. He was something of a mystic, talking for hours on end about God, what God is, what God wants for mankind, and how after death, God absorbs into his being, representative of central life force, the entity we now know as ourselves. He said that he had seen God and talked with him. He was a lonely man and often spoke lovingly of his days as a tattooed man in a sideshow, when he knew the India rubber man, the fat woman, the bearded lady, the sword swallower, the snake charmer, geeks, midgets, circus people, roustabouts, clowns, animal trainers, tightrope walkers, trapeze artists, all kinds of people connected with sideshows and big tops. For some reason, he had gotten away from all that, no longer in touch with the only element he felt comfortable in. He was vague about what had happened, but I gathered from conversational bits he had started using junk, finally getting hooked, and eventually having a run-in with the police, having served time. At any rate, he felt he could no longer go back. And one more from Herbert Huncke, the law of retribution. Some people hold grudges for a long time, perhaps until they die, and there is never a rest from the moment the grudge takes shape in their mind, until they have retaliated in a similar manner to the one who they believe is responsible, or have evened up the score, as one might say. They're on the alert to gain revenge, quite frequently working out elaborate plans and schemes to serve their purpose, and more often than not, it doesn't matter to what extent the other person is guilty. The whole idea of retribution or of gaining revenge applies not only to the grudge, but to any situation wherein one of the two people or groups of people has gained or supposedly unfairly taken advantage of the other. It is all stupid and decided waste of energy, and one of the worst aspects in human relationships. But regardless, it does occur, and like ideas resulting from the idea of competition, there are certain rules of rather rigid nature which affect the entire concept. So that, as an example, if one partner steals from the other or in some way deserts the other or lies or cheats in the world of hustlers, and particularly among those of Latin extraction and background, a knife is often used, frequently a gun. And if the two people involved are male, a so-called man usually, at the very least, promises himself he'll knock the shit out of the bastard the next time there is an opportunity. When I first began hanging around the underworld, I was cautious about careful of fulfilling or attempting to fulfill my obligations in any of my dealings where I had a partner. And the first time I held out, the result of an error of calculation on my part and an honest mistake, I was ashamed and extremely worried that perhaps the discrepancy would be discovered, and in the vernacular, I'd get my head handed to me. Nothing ever came of it, and when finally I was confronted with the situation, the time was a new partner, where I could gain at the other's expense. It took little argument with my conscience to decide to go. I should have dropped that page earlier or later. Conscience ahead. And again, I had no trouble. Then came the time when I knew beforehand there would be no way of covering up, and my act would be considered an out-and-out burn in my heart. I knew the only way of evening up eventually would be through an act of violence on the part of my partner. I took the gamble of our never meeting again, or meeting so much later the sting of the injury would be dissipated, and I could perhaps talk my way out of the worst of the consequences, and went ahead in a sense, got away with it. Although we did meet again much later, all that happened was a verbal tongue lashing. It is all right to burn one's victims as long as they can be referred to as marks, but never, never burn the guy you work with and who is your partner. Where the line of justification for an act of treachery in one instance, which ceases to be justifiable in another instance, exists, is moot question, and one, honestly speaking, I've never understood. Be that as it may, there is a law of retribution, and recently it caught up with me. At the time when I made the choice or acted accordingly to the dictates of my desire, I had been the partner of a Spanish-American cat for a period of several months and had known him about 3 years. When we became partners, we began dealing junk together, and although he was experiencing in the business, I was quite green and unaware of much of what might be expected of me. As to conduct when unexpectedly I discovered I was working someone else's territory, or when I was held up at a knife point and told to give up my junk or get cut, or the various hypes I've been subjected to. I soon discovered my coworker was very unscrupulous as to his manner of dealing with me, and although there was never anything I could use to explain without having to qualify it in some way why I felt cheated, I did, in a sense, come out on the short end of the deal. Still, in a sense, I was treated all the same, fairly and perhaps could have behaved differently in the final analysis and avoided a very unpleasant experience. We had been together several months. It was winter, and through some thoroughly high-handed manipulation on the part of my partner, I was suddenly without a place of my own to live and was living with him and his girl and feeling disgusted and completely trapped. I became somewhat desperate about what the future might hold in store were I to continue as I had been. One cold, cold morning I got up, and when I went to cook up my usual fix, my partner began complaining about the amount of stuff being used and ordered me to cut it down. I felt that since I was running the risk of being arrested at the time, the least I could have out of the deal was as much stuff as I liked, and I was annoyed with his complaint. Therefore, it took very little debating the issue when later that morning I had 18 bags of stuff in my possession, all the merchandise we had between us, and stopped to visit a young woman I knew, and she suggested I kick my habit. She would help me with the money to get to Lexington, Kentucky, where I could enter the hospital. I decided in favor of taking her up on the plan. I simply remained with her all day until it was the time to catch the bus, frequently shooting up and taking the rest with me, shooting the last of it upon my arrival in Lexington. I had shot up the 18 bags in less than 24 hours. I remained out of the city several months, and by the time I returned, I learned he was arrested and was serving time. He was gone 2 years. He was released not long ago. That's the other way to say it. I have always known there would be a day of reckoning, and I have mentioned to several people of our mutual associates. He had told everyone, and although several people thought he'd forgot, I was sure he wouldn't. I was convinced he had to prove to his friends, if nothing else, that no one gets away with crossing him. We met walking along the street. I had paused a moment to speak with an acquaintance, and as I turned around, there he was. He walked up to me, grabbed me by the arm, pulling me close to me, and sort of forced me to accompany him down the street. Meanwhile, daring me for an explanation. Suddenly, after walking a short distance, he swung his fist up into my face, cracking me on the lip, continuing to walk, again hitting me, finally hitting me again, threatening to cut me. There was nothing I could say. From his point of view, he was perfectly justified and certainly wouldn't have understood any of my abstract reasoning were I to have attempted explaining. In his eyes, he had been lenient. I understood and was grateful he hadn't cut me with a knife. We parted on somewhat agreeable terms, and at the time I thought it was wiser of me to continue avoiding him as much as possible. I was ashamed of my behavior and promised myself to act always in the future in a manner where I would never again knowingly cause someone to feel the need to retaliate or put in effect the so-called law of retribution. Herbert Huncke. Yeah, all right.